Good morning, everyone, and welcome to NISA's Spring 2024 Economic Forum. And I'm looking out the window of my house, and it really is spring. The sun is shining. It looks very beautiful out there. And of course, we had some wonderful GDP numbers this morning as well, which was good because they were, if anything, just a slight bit better than the forecast that we're going to present in just a minute. For those of you who haven't been to the forum before, we're going to have three presentations, one on the outlook for the global economy with my colleague Barry Naisber, one on the outlook for the UK economy with my colleague Ben Caswell, and one on the outlook for UK regions and households with my colleague Arnab Bhattacharjee. After that, there will be a chance for questions. The way questions work is if you could put your questions into the chat, then I will see them all. And then when we get to the question, I will ask you to ask your question. The technology people sat behind me will unmute you and allow you to show yourself on screen, and then you can ask your question and our experts will answer them. I think that's all in terms of the preamble. So I'm just going to hand straight over to Barry, who's going to present our outlook for the global economy.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and welcome everyone to our quarterly economic forum, which is covering the spring economic outlook. I'm Barry Naisbitt, and I'm going to talk about our global economic outlook. And my colleagues, as Stephen explained, will talk more about the UK. First of all, it's important to say that our global economic outlook is prepared using our NIGEM economic model. And the team of people involved in producing the forecast, very much a team effort. It's on the first slide here. So my thanks to them for all their hard work in doing that. If you'd like more details of our model, there are more details on our website. And if you'd like to consider subscribing to our model, using it yourself for your own economic forecasts or economic simulations, which we use it a lot for, then please do contact us, and we're only too pleased to speak to you. So in terms of our global economic view, I guess there's 5 themes I want to cover regarding our outlook. In no particular order of importance, but I think one interesting feature we've been noticing is the diverse experience in economic performance recently between the US and the Euro area. Second one is that, and I guess this is very much topic of the day with the MPC having made a decision yesterday and the Swedish Riksbank having cut interest rates earlier this week, is what's going to happen to interest rates. And in brief, we think that compared to what we thought 3 months ago, we think interest rates cuts will come, but they'll come later and they'll be a bit slower to come. The broad economic outlook we see as being one of steady but relatively slow global economic growth. We think that the slower path has, if you like, moderated to a new, what one might call a new normal, with annual GDP growth globally somewhere around 3–3.5% over a run of years. One other interesting feature we notice is that we now have both higher debt levels, certainly in advanced economies and also in many emerging market economies, and we also have higher market interest rates. The combination of those two, which is making it more expensive in terms of the share of GDP that is going to be used to finance debt repayments by governments, is limiting fiscal space. And this is something that we think is going to be particularly a feature for the US going forward. It'd be a feature for other countries as well, but we've actually written something in our outlook about that. I'll come on to that later. And then finally, I guess it isn't all about economics. Global geopolitics will also be a key factor, as we're seeing, as it has been over the past 2 or 3 years, both with war in Ukraine and then the conflict in the Gulf area and around Israel and Gaza. So those are the five factors I just want to talk about briefly. And then let me start on the first one about the diverse experience between the US and the Euro area. The chart on the left-hand side, the dotted lines represent the evolution of the price level in both the Euro area and the US. The US is the black dots, the Euro area is the reddish dots. And we're starting the chart here, indexing things back to 2019 Q4 equals 100, just so we start at the same place. And what you'll notice is that prices in the US have risen by almost exactly the same as they have in the Euro area to date since that period. But the solid lines, which show the evolution of GDP, shows a very different pattern. In fact, in a broadly speaking, about 5 years, US GDP growth US GDP has grown by about 5.5% to 6% more than Euro area GDP. So there's been very different performance there. And why do we think this different performance is obtained? Well, I guess the first part is a asymmetrically higher impact of Russia-Ukraine war and the subsequent rise in oil and gas prices on the European economies. So that's had more effect on dampening production in the Euro area. But also there's been a very large fiscal stimulus, relatively larger fiscal stimulus in the US than in the Euro area. And the right-hand chart looks at the decomposition of US GDP growth. You can see the consumer spending, which is the sort of solid grey bar, has made the major contribution. But you'll also see that government investment has made positive contributions in 23, and we expect this year too, and a little bit next year. And it has been the boost fiscally that has helped both consumption and the government investment bit to increase US GDP growth relative to the Euro area. If I then move on to inflation, the key point striking from the left-hand chart is obviously that inflation in the major advanced economies has fallen significantly since the peaks in mid-22, early 23. Now, it's very difficult to see on these sort of charts, but you can see that the big fall in inflation is now by and large behind us, and inflation has sort of steadied a little bit since then. And in fact, in the US, inflation has remained largely flat at around 3% since the second half of last year. Underlying or core inflation has generally fallen in these economies, not as far as headline inflation has fallen. And recent sort of demand-related factors have contributed to the monthly inflation. So monetary policy still has a role to play here. And we're projecting that inflation will keep falling, certainly within the Euro areas, the OECD as a whole. I'll come on to that in a second. But within the Euro area, one of the interesting features is the dispersion of inflation experience amongst countries has fallen quite sharply. The range now is from about 0% to about 5%. So that has come down, but it's still a little higher than in the period through most of the 2010s. So there's still, even though euro inflation has come down, there's still work to do to get it down even further. In terms of interest rate cuts, I've talked about later and fewer. For OECD inflation, we forecast it down to 3.8% this year. That's coming down from 6.7% in 2022. And it's worth saying that here on our OECD measure, we're excluding Turkey, where inflation is running well over 25% at the moment, and makes the figures look rather different. And you can see that in terms of interest rates, our forecasts are that interest rates have been marched up over the past 18 months or so, but we expect them to come down much more slowly than they were marched up. But fall they will. In terms of timing, we think probably the ECB would move first, and the Fed to follow in September, largely because ECB inflation, or euro area inflation, has fallen more than US inflation has fallen, and underlying inflation in the euro area is slightly lower than in the US. In terms of global GDP growth, we see this as being steady at around 3% a year. We've had 3.5 and 3.2. The main driver of global growth in terms of the biggest contribution is coming from emerging market economies as ever. But even there, one can see that there is some slowdown evident. And the big change probably in 2025 is we see a slower US GDP growth figure below 2% than we're expecting this year or we saw last year. But we're expecting slightly faster growth in Canada, the euro area, and Japan. We continue to expect to see relatively high rates of growth in India and China, and I'll come on to that again in a second. Just to sort of reinforce those points, on the left-hand side, you can see that the major contribution, or biggest share of global GDP growth, is coming from the emerging economies rather than the advanced. But interestingly, looking at the right-hand side chart there, one can see that China, which is the grey bars, growth in China over an average of a decade, has already fallen by about 2 percentage points, perhaps more, in the 2010s relative to 2000s. We expect that to fall by another couple of percentage points as we go forward over the 2020s as a whole. And we expect probably over the 2020s as a whole, average annual growth in India might actually just outpace that in China a little, but again, lower than in the 2010s. Turning to the high debt interest levels, you can see that on the left-hand side chart, government bond yields have risen. That, combined with higher levels of debt in dollars or pounds or euros or whatever, is clearly increasing the debt service costs. And the interesting feature we see, or we expect to see, is the forecast for US public sector debt to GDP is sort of diverging from the euro area and Canada. And that started to become something that's being talked about in the US quite a bit. The US Bureau of Fiscal Service has estimated that to make US public debt sustainable, the government should start increasing the primary balance by about 4.5% of GDP, starting from this year. In other words, increasing taxes and reducing spending. Now, not to say that that's going to happen or not, but my colleagues Ahmet Kaya and Paul Mortimer-Lee have written a box in our latest economic outlook which looks at this issue, and they find that the macroeconomic impact of such a fiscal consolidation, based on slightly different assumptions using our Niger model to simulate it, would be that the level of US GDP would be around 2 to 3% lower by 2040 than otherwise. So fiscal consolidation lowers US GDP in the medium term. So far, I've talked mostly about sort of point forecasts, which is I suppose, the bread and butter of economic forecasters. But of course, it's very important to talk about risks as well. I'm not going to show you fan charts here, but I just want to cover about sort of 6 issues that we think about, or we're thinking about, that affect our outlook. First of all, obviously, the geopolitical effects, the wider regional conflict in the Middle East, the ongoing war in Ukraine. We're seeing a year of elections in the world. Some like 40 to 50% of the population of the world will have the opportunity to vote this year, and many countries already have. And that can lead, obviously, to political changes and changes in assumptions one might make about policies. There's also the need for fiscal consolidation, certainly amongst many advanced economies. And more recently, we've seen the US dollar appreciating, which may have impacts, inflationary impacts in emerging economies, and possibly even lower capital inflows for some emerging economies. And then finally, we've talked a little bit about the secular slowdown in China. We have a box in the Outlook written by David Lubin, looking at Chinese growth prospects and the impact of geopolitics. So all these play to the risks that we see around the world economy. That's all I want to cover at the moment. Let me just leave you with the key messages and hand over to my colleague Ben, who's going to talk about the outlook for the UK economy. Thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Barry, for that excellent presentation. So now we are going to turn to the UK economy outlook, and this is a joint work with all of the colleagues listed on the screen here. So just to start with some of our key messages, as we all know, the UK entered into a shallow technical recession at the back end of last year, and this was in line with our forecast from 1 quarter ago. Going forward, we now anticipate a bounce back in economic activity with growth around 0.8% in 2024. This is consistent with the positive figures that were released this morning, which indicate that quarter-on-quarter GDP grew 0.6% in the first quarter of this year. However, as base effects continue to drop out of the headline measure and wholesale energy prices fall due to the introduction of the energy price cap, inflation continues to edge its way down to target. In fact, we anticipate that headline inflation is to dip just below the 2% target in the second quarter of this year. And naturally, that may raise the question among some, if inflation is going to dip below the target of the Bank of England, then when will rate cuts take place? Maybe in June? Well, we think this is unlikely, actually. While the headline rate is falling, it's expected to rebound later in the year as core inflation and service inflation remain incredibly persistent. As a result, we don't expect any rate cuts right away, but instead we anticipate the first rate cut in August, followed by a second rate cut at the end of this year. This gives the Bank of England some breathing space should any of the upside risks to inflation then materialize. Additionally, as we're in election year, we can't not mention fiscal policy. We now believe that in light of tax cuts and slightly revised down growth figures at the back end of last year, that the government is now not meeting its fiscal targets. So, on to GDP. As we exit the technical recession, we believe that the bounce back in economic activity will continue throughout the rest of this year, with the growth rate at around 0.8% for 2024. This is corroborated by the figures that we saw released this morning, which were very positive. However, moving forward, future growth prospects do remain relatively sluggish. We anticipate a 1% growth rate in 2025, and this is the long-run trend rate of growth for the UK economy. Beyond this, we don't expect any meaningful change in the growth rate beyond 2025, and this is simply due to the fact that underlying structural factors for the UK economy, such as low investment and low productivity growth, are something which the UK has dealt with for a long time, and the UK on average does have lower productivity and business investment relative to its OECD peers. However, with regards to risks to this forecast, the risks are on the downside, as indicated by the skew in our fan chart here. These risks are primarily stemming from large-scale geopolitical uncertainty. Now, turning to the headline rate of inflation, we now believe that some of the largest falls that we've seen over the last year or two, due to base effects dropping out of the headline measure, have mostly been exhausted. That being said, we do expect another large drop in the April numbers when they're released in a week or two. However, this is primarily being driven by base effects and the energy price cap, and this is going to exert further downward pressure on energy prices and therefore briefly push inflation below the 2% target in the second quarter. This notwithstanding, after base effects has fully been stripped out, we are left with this persistent core component of inflation, which is dominating the headline rate now. As a result, we expect inflation to sit just above target at 2.3% by the end of this year. And this is essentially due to service inflation and core inflation remaining much higher and further above the headline rate. Core inflation currently sits at 4.7 and service inflation at 6.0%. Therefore, given the importance of services in the UK economy, and given that the increase in the national living wage taking effect from April was a 9.8% increase and was anticipated by the Local Pay Commission to have impacted around 1.7 million workers, there does remain some firm upside risk to inflation. And again, this is indicated by the skew in our fan chart. So this leads us neatly onto the labour market. And as figure 1.6 shows here on the right-hand side, in grey, wage growth is robust and persistent throughout the rest of this year as workers continue to restore their real earnings from pre-pandemic. This does put real wage growth comfortably in the positive region until at least the start of 2025. However, beyond this, we expect the wage rate to settle to a sort of even growth rate around 3%. But as inflation expectations do remain relatively well anchored, this settling essentially should be sort of a consistent steady state point where we reach equilibrium. The base rate will come down and inflation should be around its 2% target. However, this growth can be sustained at least over the next year until mid-2025 without putting too much additional pressure on the headline rate of inflation. And this is because the labour market continues to soften and because of recruitment difficulties easing. And this can be seen more clearly in figure 1.22, which is the vacancy to unemployment ratio, which is an indicator of labour market tightness. And we can see overall, while there is still a slight elevation above the pre-pandemic levels, we can see that the labour market tightness is edging and moving closer towards its pre-pandemic average. So overall, while there does remain some risk due to robust wage growth and increase in the national living wage, we don't expect these to necessarily feed through to higher prices straight away. We do expect the labour market to continue its gradual loosening, and we do expect unemployment to tick up ever so slightly going forward. Now we'll turn to look for our projections for the path of interest rates. Given the persistent nature of inflation we've observed lately, we anticipate that rates will come down much more gradually than we thought relative to 1 quarter ago. We now anticipate that interest rates will reach their plateau or their equilibrium level in early 2028. And you can see this indicated by the grey line, which was our previous forecast in the winter, and our current forecast. Now, this is broadly in line with current market expectations, which show a significant readjustment in recent months regarding the speed of rate cuts. Now, this is due to higher than expected inflation for figures at home and abroad over the previous quarter or so. This means that we expect the bank to cut rates more cautiously, given the persistence in inflation and the remaining upside risks. So moving on to fiscal policy, we can now take a look at our forecast for the debt to GDP ratio, which is on the right-hand side, and the deficit to GDP ratio, which is on the left-hand side, figure 1.5 and 1.4 respectively in our outlook. So as we know, the UK's current fiscal framework stipulates that the debt to GDP ratio should be falling at the end of a 5-year horizon, and that the deficit to GDP ratio should be below a 3% target in the same period. As we can see here, indicated by the shaded region, which is the 5-year rolling target, the UK government will not meet its targets on either count. Now, this failure to meet these fiscal targets does raise questions regarding the credibility and usefulness of these existing rules. It also questions the effectiveness in guiding sound fiscal policy. So in this context of inflation coming back down to target, there cannot be an exploitation of fiscal drag in the same sense as there was last year as a means of raising revenue. As a result, it means it's quite likely that the winners of the next general election are likely to face tough fiscal choices, simply to maintain the existing provision of government service, notwithstanding any changes in the current rules. So we think that all of this together, the fact that the targets are not being met, and the fact that we think that they are now inadvertently constraining good and prudent fiscal decision-making, that this provides an impetus for a wider discussion on fiscal framework reform as we enter this election year. And finally, turning to investment, we expect business investment as a share of GDP to remain quite close to its recent levels. which means that the UK is expected to remain significantly below the OECD average with regards to its business investment. Its share of business investment is in the bottom third of OECD economies. Moreover, we do expect a small decline in public investment after a short spike. This is a result of the existing fiscal rules constraining wise and reasonable public investment due to the fact that there is simply no remaining headroom available. And to actually sustain public investment is what is required in order to actually really lead to sustained increases in productivity and output growth. Now, this is specifically unfortunate, we think, because private and public investment are complementary and both are required to encourage and boost growth in the UK economy going forward. So I will just leave you with a recap of our summary table for our forecast before I hand you on to my colleague Arnab, who will talk about the regions and households of the UK economy. Thank you very much. Over to you, Arnab.
Thank you, Ben, and Barry and Stephen before that. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining as our NISA's Spring 2024 Economic Forum today. So essentially, against the backdrop of impending elections and together with it, electoral battle lines and discontents drawn up and down, even across the country, and also the often elusive quest for the attention of the median voter, we bring to you our outlook for the UK households, the devolved nations, and the English regions. The key points that emerge from our analysis this time come against falling inflation, but with significant upside risks, as emphasized by Barry, and an economy with bounce back in output and somewhat robust wages, but sluggish growth and productivity prospects for the medium run, as emphasized by Ben. So the key messages are, as a result of this uneven recovery of household living standards, in our case, as measured by equivalized household real disposable income, along the households below average income statistics framework of the ONS. Deep and widening disparities between and within regions of the United Kingdom, including the devolved nations. And the main policy priority which emerges is to design and deliver productivity enhancing public investments, which is public investment also in particular drawing in private investment worth 4% of GDP per year. So in order to look forward, let us first look forward over the next year and try and see what holds for UK households. We think that there will be, our projections show that there will be uneven recovery of living standards, as mentioned, on the equalized household real disposable income basis. It will improve on average 6% in 2024-25 relative to 2023-24. However, that overall average masks quite a bit of distributional effects here. Households in the bottom decile will have a 2% fall. Households in the second decile are expected to have a 5% rise. This also relates partly to rises in the national minimum wage and the national living wage. Households in deciles 4 to 9, 7 to 8% rise. So there is, quite a bit of interesting distributional patterns here. But how did we come here? Well, this is on the back of substantial hit to household disposable income, which has come over a longer period of time ever since the pandemic hit. And here we try to portray that through this somewhat busy chart. Well, what you see in the maroon bars is the heat from cost of living to household budgets, and the gray ones is the hit due to rising rents or borrowing costs. And that is substantial across the whole of the distribution. On the top end, above the level 0 line, we see what support the state has provided. And we can see that that is actually relatively small relative to the hit to household budgets. As a result of that, in the solid line at the bottom, starting at the bottom on the left, we see that the large impacts were felt in the bottom of the income distribution. Well, in the bottom decile, around 8%, but even higher in deciles 2, 3, 4, even decile 5. This reflects the emergence of the squeezed middle in the household distribution and understanding of experiences of household incomes in Britain. So that is the overall picture. Let us now unpack this a bit more with respect to what central state support was provided since 2022. The important bit here is that large part of that support at the bottom end was provided from cost of living payments, and at the top end by energy price guarantee and energy bill support payment. But particularly, energy price guarantee was very regressive and really supported or really enhanced the purchasing power of the more affluent households. So this is a feature. This has been a feature of the distributional or welfare policy of the government in the past 2 or 3 years. But this is what emerges as a result of our analysis. So if we want to look then in terms of monetary numbers, what this implies, since 2022, on average, a household has received about £1,900 from the Chancellor. Now, at the bottom end, in the lowest decile, they received a bit more on average, about £2,000. But all the middle deciles received less, so they received less, so that is the squeezed middle. And again, as a result of the energy price guarantee at the top end in deciles 9 and 10, they received substantially more, about 2,400 more for the 9th decile, and the top decile about 3,700. So which is quite a bit, almost twice as much as the average. So that being state support, or the nature of state support, let us now turn to key messages for the devolved nations and regions. As Ben highlighted, we expect anemic growth, and this will perpetuate gaps between and within UK regions. We do not really see much evidence or any evidence of regional regeneration, but we'll be coming back to this question in future outlooks and future publications from the National Institute in terms of evaluating the government's performance with respect to leveling up. And productivity differentials across the country remain high, and they are a considerable drag on UK growth. So equalized. So one aspect of this is that we present in the current outlook is equalized household disposable income by region. And essentially in this map, what is very interesting to observe is that London really recovered quite well from the COVID crisis and the subsequent major shocks that have hit the economy and society, to consolidate its position somewhat. At the other end, the places which have, or the regions which have been lagging are Wales, or have been hit very hard, are Wales and West Midlands in particular, also Yorkshire and Humberside, and Northern Ireland. So essentially, again, we see here very little evidence of leveling up, true leveling up. Moving on, productivity across the UK. Yes, in London, as we know, productivity is about twice as high as the UK on average, but also it is rising. It is expected to rise further by the end of 2025. On the other hand, in the Midlands, it's falling. And this is again marks a clear disjuncture between different, the trajectories in different parts of the country. The Midlands being particularly hit by slump in manufacturing growth, and also some issues with respect to trading as a result of the emerging new trading arrangements of Britain. So in terms of growth, then output growth is flatlining across the country, and that undercuts any efforts to close the gap. Employment is the labor market situation is very unstable, very uncertain at the moment, but employment levels are stable and employment growth is low, and that is the future that we foresee, or the projections that we make. Productivity growth is low, and there's a flat trajectory overall, but even falling in some parts of the country, which is very alarming. Further, regional GVA, gross value added, so our output measure is gross value added. As we can see, relative to 2019, most regions, all devolved nations have reached output levels above the pre-pandemic benchmarks. Only region that falls below, still rise below, and is expected to lie below is the Midlands, right? So that is combining the East and West Midlands. So this is basically summarizing the findings on that chart. So GVA growth overall is flatlining. Employment, you can see that there is quite a bit of uncertainty in the labor market, which is reflected in recent data and revisions and so on and so forth that we have seen in the past, something like a year now. But our prognosis for the future is flat employment trajectories, somewhat higher in Scotland and England, compared to the UK, compared to 2019 levels, but then somewhat lower, settling somewhat lower than pre-pandemic benchmarks in Wales and Northern Ireland. Amongst the English regions, most places have recovered their employment levels to pre-pandemic standards, except of course the Midlands. So employment levels again remain stable. And the Midlands, Northern Ireland, and Wales, they remain below pre-pandemic levels. London and Scotland, have seen higher employment growth. Our projection, however, is stable levels over the medium-run future. Productivity across England is very similar to the what we saw earlier. So there are projected falls in productivity, particularly in the Northeast and the West Midlands. At the same time, London powers ahead. Moving on, our concluding thoughts are lower income households, they have taken a disproportionately larger hit and received smaller state support. And despite moderate wage rises, their living standards are going to stay substantially below pre-pandemic levels. Specific policy actions that we suggest are raising personal allowance and tax bands thresholds, and raising public investment to 4 to 5% of GDP per annum. But this is largely as a productivity enhancing measure and meant essentially to crowd in private investment. Right? So public investment will work together with private investment and accelerate disbursement of leveling up funds. Thank you very much. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Arnab. Thank you very much, all of our presenters. Excellent presentations. I feel I've learned a lot over the 3 days that we've been presenting our outlooks. There's a lot in them. I strongly recommend reading the UK Economic Outlook, which is free, and anybody who has access to the global, I strongly recommend reading that as well. We have a number of questions here ready for people to ask. So I'm going to start, if I may, with I have a user called Farzaneh, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great. Well, we're waiting for you. We also have a question from Ryan Carter as well. Again, may be easier to find you. I notice my technical people are looking for the people so they can unmute them. But either Ryan Carter or someone who's just titled user, but whose name is Farzaneh, if we can get either of them unmuted and asking their questions, that would be good. Ryan, I can see you. Let me see if I can unmute you. You might be able to do that. No, I can't. Neil, any luck unmuting Ryan?
Ryan, if you unmute yourself, then
Ryan, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question. Doesn't seem to be happening. Farzaneh, if you could unmute yourself.
Hi, hi everyone.
Thank you. Go ahead, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, could you hear me?
We
Is it
can,
okay?
we can.
Yeah,
we
thank
can,
you.
yes.
Thank you for your presentation, and great to know about it, and your information was very exciting for me. About the peak of inflation during the 2023 in the Europe, it was peak of inflation. It was higher than the US. I want to ask about the cause of this phenomena. It's just about the energy price, or something else may cause this phenomena.
Barry, one for you, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you ever so much for the question. I showed a chart earlier on which shows that the peak in Euro area inflation was somewhere around 11%, whereas in the US the peak was just below 10. And in fact, you know, on the start of the chart I showed, which was start of 21, Euro inflation came from a lower rate than the US. So, you know, makes the point more strongly than you made, which is great. I mean, I think that the answer to your question is energy is the largest part of the explanation for it, but it's not the only part. The other major part comes around sort of food and raw materials costs, which have affected the Euro area more than the US. But in terms of sort of energy dependence, the Euro area, and at least initially, was far more dependent on importing gas, particularly from Russia, than the US, which is now, if I'm not wrong, either the world's largest or second largest oil producer. So that sort of energy security, if you like, helped the US relative to the Euro area. But I think the point I'd make, if I could, just one more moment, is to say that, I mean, although the Euro area did overshoot the US a little bit, the key point is that both of those rates of inflation were incredibly high. We're talking sort of double-digit inflation effectively, even albeit for a short period in both areas, which was clearly, you know, a great shock to both of those economies. So even if one was a little bit higher, they were both severe economic shocks.
So, sorry, could I continue my question?
Of course.
Yeah, thank you. I think this happen, and this phenomena engage the Europe shift to sustainability, and for example, solar system for energy and like this. I think it's a big engagement for the Europe because of the energy crisis in the world, we forecast for the future. It's a big challenges for countries, energy and sustainability, and some, for example, climate change. It's cause of these kind of the energy, fossil fuels, and it's I think it's a good way for the Europe and Europe countries that shift to this kind of energy, solar system, for example, wind energy, and like this.
Yeah, can I just say I agree with that entirely, but I think I'd add two slight points to it. It's also made countries think more about security of energy supply, and that's also boosted the move towards sort of greener technologies, which tend to be domestic dependent. But it's also opened, I think, a wider debate about food security and supply of food security supply. So I mean, you're right. It's opened interesting debates, and I guess that's the way forward. Thank you ever so much for your questions.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Baz. No, thank you, Barry. Ryan is having technical difficulties, so I'm actually going to ask his question on his behalf. And Barry, it's another one for you, which is, when looking at estimated economic growth for emerging economies, we had Russian economic growth was negative, but over the next few years, we're forecasting it to become positive. Is this modeled on the assumption that the Ukraine war will end? Or will Russia become a war economy, or will Western sanctions ease, or they're just finding them very easy to ignore? Any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. And so, difficult question. We don't forecast the end of a war or a start of a war anywhere in what we're doing. But I think it's fair to say that I'm also not an expert on the Russian economy. But I mean, it's just worth pointing out, GDP in Russia fell in 2022 by about 2.1%, but we estimate it rose last year by 3.5%. And our forecast, just based on sort of a small model of the Russian economy, and looking at productive potential there. So there's no sort of underlying sort of geopolitical view about events that may or may not happen. I hope that helps.
So, sorry, Ryan. Although, I mean, one thing we can say is that the positive growth last year was domestically generated. I mean, so you could tell a story. I mean, it's hard to tell, of course, with Russian data, but that a lot of that was due to spending on military equipment, etc., to fight the war. So I think there's definitely an element of that. But as Barry says, I mean, your guess probably is as good as mine as to when this war will come to an end. I just hope it is soon. That's all I will say on that. Now, Stephen Gregson has a whole bunch of questions. Stephen, if you can unmute yourself, but just try to stick to 2 questions, I think. Otherwise, Ben, who will be answering them, will not be happy with me.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Stephen. Ben. I'll go the first one, actually. Given that the Bank of England has confirmed that it takes 18 months for base rate changes to impact the economy, and 18 months ago, base rate was about 3.5%. Does that suggest that there's more macroeconomic pain for the UK to experience through this coming year and into 2025?
Right. Okay. So I would maybe characterize it slightly differently to that. I think the way that the bank thinks of it is that usually under typical circumstances, it takes around 18 months for the maximum or full effect of interest rate rises to be felt, rather than just any effect at all. I think that's the sort of the maximum and full effect for it to percolate through the transmission mechanism of the economy. So also, in anticipation of rates changing, markets are obviously forward-looking. So a lot of these prices are built in as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say that 18 months is the lag for the first effects to be felt. I think that we have seen a lot of the effects already. Naturally, for example, banks increase the mortgage rates, and also savings rates go up as well. So people save more money. So usually these effects are happening relatively quickly, but of course they stick in the system for a little bit longer. But I wouldn't necessarily say that this means that, oh, well, there's a lag of 18 months for it to fully, just go through. I think there's not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily agree with the way that it was characterized, that's all. So I wouldn't describe, oh, okay, there's so much more pain in the future. The UK economy is pinned down by fundamentals, and essentially investment and productivity growth are relatively low. So it's going to remain on trend growth around 1%. And that's how I'd sort of characterize it.
Thanks, Ben. Just thinking about, for my second question, about pay rises and what's been happening with pay over the last 2 to 3 years. And I think certainly earlier this year, if not last year, the Bank of England was talking about pay rises and that being a concern that it might fuel domestic inflation. But to what extent are the recent levels of pay rises, which might be outstripping inflation, simply, in quotation marks, allowing employees to play catch up in real terms to repair their lost real term spending power, which was eroded during the start of the very high inflationary period?
Yeah, so that's right. During the inflationary period, there was a lot of sellers inflation going on, which means that essentially firms accumulated quite a lot of profits. So their margins were quite high. So when the labor market became very, very tight in 2022 and 2023, this means that firms did have the capacity to absorb some of these pay rises when workers bargained for them. So really, it was an erosion of margins going on, and that's why it didn't filter through into a sort of wage price spiral as much. Now that a lot of those margins have been exhausted, we see that essentially that the labor market is loosening and it's softening, recruitment difficulties are easing, and the labor market's cooling down. So there's obviously been a bargaining sort of in favor of workers to restore some of their real earnings. But now that's kind of plateauing out, and that's reflected by our wage growth forecasts, which were indicated in, I think, our labor slide that I showed earlier.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Stephen, I may come back to you for one or two of your other questions, but let me go to a couple of other people first. I've got Dimitri Korpakis. If we can unmute Dimitri, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is about the UK's levelling up policies and whether you could provide a first quick assessment of their effect on UK regions. I know it's probably a bit early to have such an assessment, but do you have any indication of how things are going up? Thank you.
That's definitely one for our that, I think.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dimitri. That's a brilliant question. Yeah, well, a couple of things to say. One is that leveling up as a mission is a very long-term mission. So while we say that we do not find substantial evidence of leveling up, we are only probably expected to find very large impacts in the medium to long run. It's not going to happen over 2 or 3 years. Now, the allocation of leveling up funds is sort of a bit mixed. Means the picture here is a bit mixed. We think that the government has its heart in the right place here, and it wants to engage in serious leveling up activity. At the same time, the allocation of leveling up funds is only about 3.5% of the total public infrastructure investments over the parliamentary term. So it is actually very small. Yes, its allocation has been somewhat fair and equitable across places, but the allocation of infrastructure investment as such has still somewhat been concentrated. Maybe, one can argue for good reasons upon more prosperous regions of the country. So the progress towards leveling up generally is going to be bumpy. But what we are doing is that we are charting this out as part of a Nuffield Foundation funded project on regional regeneration, and you are going to see more insights coming out of what we are doing and how we see the trajectory, how we see the lay of the land there quite soon over the summer and onwards. And in that effort, we are also going to make comparisons with some places in continental Europe and elsewhere in the world with respect to a similar regional policy. So that please watch this space. We are slowly filling it in.
Fantastic. Thanks, Arnaud. The question from Rebecca Driver. 'Cause, If you can unmute yourself, there you go.
Hopefully I have. Thank you, Stephen. I had a question about the chart on public and private investment growth. And specifically, when you were talking about it, Ben, you mentioned that the two were complementary. Now, eyeballing your chart, it struck me that there was a negative correlation between the two series. And I wondered whether or not it's simply a matter of the lags involved. So you need to fill the potholes before kind of the private sector productivity can come through, or whether I'd slightly misread the chart. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, for your question. So I think there is a sense in which you do need, obviously, public infrastructure investment. However, you cannot have one completely without the other, right? So I think they are complementary in that sense. Moreover, I'd also say that at the moment, given the sort of fiscal framework that we have, there is a sort of de facto pro-cyclicality to public investment, which is that obviously when the economy is in not such a good time, therefore there's less fiscal headroom and public investment expenditure is cut and it's not sustained. Whereas in practice, if you think about automatic stabilizers, really this should, if anything, go in the opposite direction. When the economy is down, we should spend more on public investment, and we should essentially have an automatic stabilizer which attempts to sort of smooth out the fluctuations in the business cycle rather than amplify them. But the current fiscal rules, because they limit and constrain well thought out and measured public investment, they kind of act as a de facto pro-cyclical component for that, which might explain some of the negative correlation that you observed by eyeballing that chart. But obviously we'd have to dig a little bit deeper if we were to make any sort of hard and fast comments about correlations. But I will look at that. It's a very interesting point. So thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Ben. There's a brilliant segue there actually into a question that I have from Peter Dixon. So if we can find Peter and allow him to unmute himself.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning, just about. I fully agree with Ben that the fiscal rules, fiscal framework in the UK at the moment is probably not fit for purpose anymore. I guess the question is, as we look forward, are we talking now about simply raising more taxes in terms of either, raising the level of taxes or, widening the tax base itself? Or is there something more fundamental we need to consider in terms of framing the fiscal rules? And I guess the second part of that question is, do you think that politicians are currently, or does anybody have a sense that politicians are currently willing to have that debate? Because I'm not hearing very much about it in public life.
Ben, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's a very good point, very good question. So I think regards to the fiscal rules, there's quite a few angles that we can sort of attack it from. And I think given that it's an election year, there is actually more momentum than there otherwise would be around a topic like this, because, the name fiscal framework is it's a little dry. So if there's any chance that we have to sort of make a splash, it's probably this year. But with regards to the sort of key issues, I think one of them is the time horizon as well. And just thinking about simply how long it takes for a public investment project to actually pay off and filter through into higher GDP. It's well outside the 5-year window. And it's really this component of the time horizon, which is one of the key constraints. I mean, you could think about extending the horizon. That's one aspect of it. But there are other institutional aspects which are also worth considering. And I think one important component as well is sort of decoupling the economic and political cycles. So having a fixed schedule for fiscal events is also something that's very important and would provide a lot of stability for people going forward. And that would also help private business investment to plan for the future. If they know that these fiscal events are scheduled in the same way that monetary policy meetings are scheduled, it would give them a sort of marker to look towards. And that would be a very useful and quite easy innovation to make. So I'm hoping that this will create some traction given an election year. Also, there's talk about simply removing public investment expenditure from the day-to-day spending, which is something that Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, mentioned in her May's lecture. So discounting that would essentially remove that kind of time horizon issue from public investment. So thank you for your question. I'm happy to let anyone else speak on that if Stephen wants to add anything.
No, I was just going to add on widening the tax base. I mean, something we have done some work on, as I think you might even know, Peter, is on a land value tax, which seems, I mean, if you do need to be looking for new efficient taxes, that seems to be the obvious place to look, given that such a tax is not distortionary if done properly. It's not immediately obvious that it would be regressive in any sense, probably the reverse. And, you know, it might help to start improving the way that we actually use land in the UK. I notice Chris Giles has just published something where he walked around the capital ring and found a whole bunch of land which could very easily be used for house building, but is for whatever reasons either empty or used for other purposes. I think his particular favourite was a polo ground, although that provoked a bit of reaction from the owners. Anyway, on that note, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for excellent presentations. I'd love to thank everyone in the audience for some really excellent questions and good discussion. Stephen, I apologize that we were only able to get to 2 of your questions. I think there's definitely more for us to be thinking about there, and maybe if Ben has some time this afternoon, he might consider putting some answers together and emailing them to you if you want to contact us directly. Apart from that, just my job to wish everybody a great rest of the day. Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the sunshine, and we'll see you all in 3 months' time. Cheers then. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.